We've spent the last few modules building a strong foundation. Now we have all the pieces in place to finally dive into the code for the rest of the course. There are very few slides from here on out. We have the knowledge that we need, so let's put it to use and start coding. Before we start setting up Redux, I want to warn you. Redux will likely feel intimidating, a lot of work. Adding additional features requires much less work. Adding it up, things will get much easier. Adding additional features requires much less work. So you'll notice that things get easier as we progress through the course. So please be patient. After we set up the first feature, you'll see that adding more features takes much less time and also has a clear, predictable flow. If you're confused after we add this first feature, don't worry. I was too. We'll add a few more features, and I think you'll find that the repetition will help the flow. Build our first features and action changes by wire. In this module, we'll experience the full flow of working with Redux by building a single. For our first use of Redux, let's create a new course. And to do that, we'll build our first container component using the courses page component as our starting point. We're going to need a form to input a course, so let's declare some state. I'll declare a constructor, which accepts props. Within the constructor, we can declare our state. And we'll render. We'll begin by declaring a form and React these days. Now let's go down to render and add a course form. So I'm going to delete the existing H2. We'll begin by declaring a form. Inside that form, we'll put our H2 with a header for courses and an H3 underneath that says add course, since we're adding a course. We'll declare an input with a type of text and an onChange handler that calls handle change. We'll declare that in a moment. For the value, we'll set it to this.state.course.title. Then we'll declare an input with a type of submit and set the value to save. So this will be our save button. Hit save and prettier reformats. We need to declare this change handler, so let's come up here and make that happen. Say handle change. We'll accept an event. First, let's create a copy of our existing course object, which we'll set to a const. Again, in modern JavaScript, we should prefer using const or let and avoid using var. What we want to do is use the spread operator, which is 3 dots, to copy the current course from state. And then we want to set the title to a new value. That new value is getting passed in on event.target.value. Now that we've created a copy of our course object that reflects the new title, we can call setState and pass it that new course. So let's talk through what we've done here. Up here on 15, we used object spread to copy the state, and then we overwrote the title by setting it to the target.value. Passed in on the event. Any values that we specify on the right-hand side overwrite the left-hand side, and we could specify as many arguments as we like here within this object literal. Now down here, where we're setting course, I can omit the right-hand side here since it's in syntax. React state as immutable. So we cloned our existing state, made a change to it, and then called setState with that new object. Technically, I should use the functional form of setState here since I'm setting state based on previous state, but I'll show how to do that in an upcoming clip. Let's load this in the browser and see if it works. Nothing happens. This tells me there's an error. The this context is not this, I need this. Online works because we reallocated on every range function here, I suggest you throughout the course. We can use a now we have a simpler way of declaring state. This still initializes our state when the component is instantiated, but I prefer this approach because in the course is classes for now, but you'll see. Now that our change handler is working, let's add a submit handler to our form. I'll say on submit is equal to this.handler to the save button ability reasons. With this on submit handler up here, the enter key will also submit our form. Course.title. I'll jump over here to the browser, type in a course, and hit save, and we don't get an alert. We can see that the entire page posts back, and that's why we're not seeing the alert. What we need to do is prevent the form from causing the page to reload. So our handle submit function will receive an event, and we can call event.preventDefault right here to keep it from posting back. So this tells the browser to prevent its default behavior. If I try to submit it though, it will fail because we'll have the same binding problem that we did before. Save, an arrow, it's the title that we've entered. Redux flow, let's create a few folders where we'll keep our Redux related files, called Redux. This is handy since we tend to work with multiple Redux related files at the same time, but totally optional. Redux doesn't have any opinions about how you structure your folders. Inside this Redux folder, let's create a new folder called Actions. This is where we'll store all our actions, such as saving a course. Inside this folder, this file will hold our course-related action creators. And since we're creating a course, let's call our first action creator createCourse. We will export a function, and that function will be called createCourse. And it will accept a course as an argument. Our action creator returns a plain object and it must have a type property. We're going to set the type to create course. And since this is a constant, I'm going to put it in all caps. Again, that's not required, it's just a common convention. Then for our payload, we're going to pass along the course that is passed in as an argument. Remember, this function is called an action creator because that's just what it does. It creates an action. The type property specifies string heap can be, and I can shorten it because object shorthand syntax. We've created our action, now we need a function that will handle the action, and we'll call it courseReducer.js. Inside, we're going to export a function, set it as the default export, and we'll call this function courseReducer. Remember, all reducers accept state and an action as their arguments. Now for this state argument, we need to decide how we want to initialize state. We'll use the default argument syntax to specify that state should be initialized to an empty array, because this will end up storing an array of courses. Inside our reducer, we'll create a switch statement that looks at the action type that gets passed in. The action type that we just created was create course. So let's look for that. If the action type is create course, for now I'm going to do this. Action.course. Now don't do this. It is immutable. Remember that whatever is returned from our reducer becomes the new state for that particular reducer. So this will update our redux store by adding the new action passed in on action.course to our redux store. It's also important to always declare a default on a redux reducer. And for our default here, as usual, we will return state. This way, if some other action is dispatched that this particular reducer doesn't care about, for instance, maybe it's an action that's related to author data or products, some other data that's not related to this reducer, then it should just return the state untouched. And again, up here, I'm using the spread operator to clone state and then also clone the course passed in. So this ends up creating a new array that contains all of the existing courses and that one additional course passed in on our action. Also, for this course, we're going to keep it simple and store the courses as a simple array of objects, but for large data sets, you can consider storing by ID instead. To arrange by ID, you can declare an object instead of an array. Each tool like for more, a common concern about Redux is the existence of these switch statements and reducers. Now, this doesn't bother me, but if you don't like the switch statement of your store's state changes, call it in the same, all of our reducers to import. To get that particular function from the Redux package. Then I'm going to import the reducer that we just created. Which was called courses and is in the same directory. Now let's create a const called root reducer, and we will call combine reducers. This will combine all of our reducers together. For now, we only have one reducer, so this isn't actually necessary, but we're setting this up now to prepare ourselves for the future. Finally, so that we can use this reducer, I'm going to export default root reducer. So notice that we pass combine reducers an object, and each property is set to a corresponding reducer. Now, since we only, I can name this import whatever I like. How we reference. Next up, let's create our Redux store. In Redux, there's a single store. So in the Redux folder, let's create a new file and call it configure store.js. There's no need to put this in a folder since we'll only have one of this type of file. When creating a store, it's useful to define a function that configures the store, because we'll call this function at our application's entry point. This way, the store will get configured when our application starts up. First, let's import create store from Redux. This is the function. Function we call to create a Redux store. And let's also import our root reducer from our reducers folder. Note, since I called it index.js, I don't have to say /index here. That is implied. Now let's declare our configure store function. We will export default a function and call it configure store. This function will take one argument, which is initial state. So we could initialize our store with some data when compose and make. We're nearly done configuring Redux. We've created our first action, we created our first reducer, we've set up our store configuration, and now we need to update our app's entry point to instantiate our store. So let's open index.js out here in the root of our source directory. First, let's add an import for configure store. And under the import, we can instantiate the store. I'm not going to pass in initial state to our store, but if you are creating a server-rendered app, you might choose to do so here. Now let me explain. You might be confused about the difference between passing initial state here and setting the initial state within our reducer. Now currently, our reducer sets the initial state using a default parameter in the reducer. So passing initial state here is merely for overriding the default parameters that we specify in our reducers. So when would you end up passing initial state to the configure store call? Well, if you're wanting to rehydrate your store using some separate state that's passed down from the server or stored in local storage, then this would be a good place to do so. We now have a configured instance of our store that's set to a constant called store. But what do we do with it? That's where a companion library comes into play. If you're using Redux with React, then you'll want to use the React Redux library. So let's go back up and import that. I'm going to import provider, and I like to alias it as Redux provider just for clarity, but that's totally optional. We'll import it from React Redux. Provider is a higher order component that provides your Redux stored data to child components. Now let's come down here in render and call Redux provider. And we will pass it our store on props. And I need to get my closing tag right. Now our app will be able to access our Redux store because our entire app is being wrapped in the provider component. So good news, this wraps up the boilerplate of our Redux configuration. Now we can end up putting our store to use by connecting our first container component to work with Redux. Okay, I know that was a lot of plumbing and a lot to take in, but the good news is most of the work that we just did only has to happen once. As you'll see, now that we have this infrastructure in place, and at the top, let's import connect from React Redux. Then jump down to the very bottom of the component. And instead of exporting our plain courses page component, we're going to decorate our component using connect. Remember, the connect function connects our components and call courses page. We could call connected state and we'll just return that array of courses out of state. So we'll say state.courses. And when I hit save, Prettier does reformat our code. When declaring map state to props, be as specific as possible about the data that you expose to the component. For example, if you expose the entire Redux store, then the component will re-render when any data changes in the Redux store, and that's not good. So instead, be specific. Request exactly the data that your component needs, and no more. As you can see, we're not using this second parameter, own, to decide what actions we want to our actions. Property injected automatically. So we'll say actions from our Redux folder. Now we have access to the create course action in our component. So down here on 19, where we were alerting, instead, let's call the create course action in our save course function. So we'll say this.props.dispatch anymore. Now line 19, here we're dispatching the create course action and anything. It would just be a function that would return an object. I'll go back up here to the top and import prop types. Dispatch prop types.func. You can say then let's go down under courses page, and we can say courses page.prop types. Equals dispatch prop types.func.is is required. So now we've clarified that we expect dispatch to be passed in to the courses page component, and it will be passed in because connect automatically passes dispatch in if we omit that second argument, which was map dispatch to prop. And great news, this wraps up our Redux flow. And then we can step through the full Redux flow to see how this works. Our courses page is now connected to the Redux store, and the list of courses is available on this.props.courses